Hello, I'm Professor Ian Mell, Professor in Environmental Landscape Planning and Head of Department for the Department of Planning, Property and Environmental Management here at the University of Manchester in the UK. And it's a great pleasure to be at this fourth Brazilian Symposium on City, Landscape and Nature and the first International Congress on Landscape, Urban Space and Sustainability. I'm really excited to talk to you today about the way in which we look at green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. And the title of my presentation is Bridging Design, Policy and Practice, Learning from Green Infrastructure-Led Regeneration in Global Cities. And just to set a bit of context to here, what we'll be looking at today is a host of examples from around the world that highlight some of the best practice that we have for investing in nature in urban areas and the ways in which this differs depending on geographical context. I think it's always important to recognise that the location that we're working in, the ways in which different political actors and different stakeholders in both government, in communities and in the development sector have to work and interact with each other. One of the things that has really fed into these ideas is the growing crises that we see in the world, partly around climate change and biodiversity loss, but also public health and well-being, linked to things like urban form and urban function, but also the quality and the design of urban space and nature within that. And so what I'm going to propose is that we reframe some of these conversations to place nature at the heart of urban development. And therefore it becomes essential infrastructure in all development debates. And this helps us to really position green infrastructure or nature-based solutions, or whichever our favourite term for urban nature is, into the right kinds of conversations with politicians, with people who control finances, but also with communities as we talk to them and work with them to co-design better and more sustainable places for the future. And part of this is understanding how we integrate nature into everyday life, something I think is being done incredibly well in some parts of Brazil, but maybe not everywhere, and how we think about the bigger picture versus the local. So what are we trying to do to climate change, climate proof our cities, but also how does that then feed down to individual neighborhoods and individual pieces of land or homes for people? And some of this will obviously touch on some of the more technical ideas of green infrastructure, green walls, green roofs. Others are more about the social and cultural understandings of place and how we interact with them. So I think it's really important to have this combination of people and place, the old and the new, those traditionals and more modern approaches that we have, the technocratic and the more culturally promoted understandings of nature to really highlight what we mean by both green infrastructure and how we can integrate these ideas into sort of nature-led regeneration in global cities. So I hope you enjoy the presentation, and if you have any questions, my details are on the screen and at the end as well. So just to contextualize this a little bit, I think we have to think about what green infrastructure is. And I'll use green infrastructure rather than nature-based solutions, although I think they can be used relatively interchangeably in most cases. And if we're talking about green infrastructure, we're talking about this whole portfolio of different types of urban greening that we can use to deliver a whole range of different benefits, be they climatic, health and well-being, economic or socio-cultural. So from our standard street trees, urban parks to public and private gardens, we're thinking about lakes and ponds and waterways. We're thinking about larger areas of urban or peri-urban woodland. We might even think about green walls, green roofs and cycle paths as part of that greener grey technology that we might use, and even things like formal green belts and allotments. And what I think is really important here is that it starts to introduce the notions of scale into what we're talking about. So how can these ideas be delivered at different scales? It can also provide us with a way to start thinking about landscape and nature as being multifunctional. The fact that it can deliver a whole host of different benefits and functions simultaneously. Now, that's not to say that all green infrastructure has to do everything all the time, but I think it is important to recognise that our landscapes need to deliver on more than one principle at once. We also get to promote ideas around connectivity between people and nature, but also habitat connectivity in terms of greenways and such like. And this notion that we have to have that access to nature at a number of different scales, be it at the city scale, but most definitely at the community and the local scale as well. And if we start to think about green infrastructure almost as a portfolio of elements, we can start to see how that might be applied in different ways in different locations. And so these principles have been discussed extensively in the literature, and mainly that notions of connectivity, multifunctionality, access to nature at a number of scales, that consideration of natural and human and economic functions and amenities put together, the ways in which we look at landscapes as being adaptive, so they're not static, there's a plasticity and a flexibility to them to actually react positively to change over time. And that we're integrating a whole series of different stakeholders, be it more political and formal to communities and informal, into the development of policy and delivery. And I think if we think about this from a temporal, geographical, scalar, and disciplinary perspective, we can start to frame green infrastructure, and particularly landscape-led green infrastructure, as a response to change over time, be it positive or not, that there's geographical variation depending on where we are around the world in terms of delivering these ideas. As already mentioned, this notion that scale is super important in terms of what and where and how we develop green infrastructure. And of course, that there are different disciplines who are engaged in this process. And it's important to recognize that different disciplines, be it engineers or water specialists, be it arborists or botanists, all have a different perspective on what green infrastructure might be. And so if we think about this in a little bit more a visible sense, that we can think about GIs offering places to enjoy, be healthy and enjoy and support well-being, that they support community building and empowerment, their direct reactions to climate change and biodiversity loss. They can be really positive in terms of local economic growth, so people want to live in nicer and greener places, for example. They can support recreation and education, and there's certainly a lot of evidence to suggest that people who live or go to school in greener places actually attain better in their education. We can think about it from aesthetic qualities and that interactivity, but also we can think about GI as a form of traffic calming, of disaster resilience, of screening for pollution and that interception as well. So I think what we really need to think about is that how do we convince people that these things matter? And again, I think it's that presentation of GI as a way to look at landscape-led design as a facilitator, almost an activator of these spaces, and a reaction to the negatives that we perceive in urban environments, pollution, flooding, a lack of access to high density, and so on. And therefore, we're looking at ways to integrate green infrastructure in a number of different ways in urban contexts. And so when we're thinking about these things, we have to inherently start to think about the politics of development, who gets to build what and where, the economics of this, so what does something cost versus what are the returns on investment, and who pays for and who benefits from investments in landscape-led design, how they respond to cultural understandings of place, and therefore that knowledge or that relationship people have with history, but also then what their potential relationship will be in the future, the way in which urban ecology has developed and diversified because of specific urban characteristics, and how we try and integrate some of those ideas or manage them. And therefore, what the urban form looks like. Are we thinking about high density? Are we thinking about high rise? Are we thinking about integrating large urban parks? Are we thinking about more pocket parks and community scale pieces of green infrastructure? And how can we think about our waterways as part of this portfolio of spaces as well? So when we're looking at urban development and the way in which landscape can be integrated into this, we are really reacting to a whole series of different eras of what's gone on before. So how have places developed in a certain form? Have they developed effectively from an ecological standpoint? And are they delivering for social and economic benefits as well? And I think if we look globally, we can see that in some places the answer is definitely yes, but in many, we could do a lot better in terms of what we're doing. And so one way to conceptualize this ever so slightly is to think about it from a more technocratic or a social perspective. So thinking about how we bring in metrics and numbers and quantities of green space or landscape-led design to deliver on us. And that's certainly the way in which we might react to things about health and well-being, for example. How do we get X percentage of people to be healthier and reduce costs? But that doesn't necessarily always work in terms of the ways in which we consider the more engineered solutions and how that maybe does or doesn't work. We also need to think about this shift from the technical approaches to GI investment. So are we solely focusing on quantitative analysis and metrics, so numbers? Are we thinking about the experience and that interactivity of green infrastructure? Because I think the latter is incredibly important to understand the ways in which GI can support livability and that daily interactivity, which is something that I think we're all aiming to work towards. And so if we start to think about how we manage these technical versus socio-cultural perspectives, how we think about different elements and how they all fit together to create those multifunctional networks of connected spaces, I think it's useful to look internationally to see where policy discussing these ideas has been either successful or maybe slightly less successful. And if we take the example here of Singapore and China, we can see a history of investment in urban greening programs, some of which have date back from the 1950s, and some which are more geared toward the 1980s onwards. And what I think is interesting about looking at these two particular locations is that the promotion of urban greening ideas has come from the top. They've come from central government, and they've been cascaded down via cities and municipalities into local action plans. But I think where we see a difference is the ways in which politics has really shaped some of these ideas in slightly different ways. So, for example, there's a very strong top-down and approach done in Singapore, which came through a series of prime ministers to really link the value of landscape and the value of nature with the Singaporean identity. So, thinking about national tree planting days and the green city, and then the garden city ideas that we have. And I think these have been really successful in transcending generations and have come out to fruition in terms of more advanced, more novel, more innovative greening plans that looks at horizontal and vertical greening, that looks at connectivity and connectors to support movement, and that looks at the ways in which energy and natural resources have to be managed due to the constraints placed upon Singapore as an island state. Whereas when we start to look at China, we start to see this succession of programs to invest in urban greening and urban nature, some of which have been successful, most notably the Spun Cities and I'd say the National Forest City Programme, but others which have come and gone because either the political, the financial support for them, or that link between technology and design and application hasn't necessarily been so strong. And so I think what we see in China is a constant renewal of these ideas, depending on what the most current driver of green space or blue space interventions are. So that might be around low carbon, it might be around net zero, it might be around eco cities, or it might be around livable cities. But I think what's incredibly interesting here is that really only the Spun Cities and the Forest Cities have stuck. They have tenure, and they're still being delivered now. And what we kind of see here is China acting as a net exporter of best practice and knowledge exchange, particularly around Spun Cities, in terms of trying to showcase and educate other parts of the world about water sensitive urban design. So I think there are very strong links between a constructive and a supportive policy environment and the ways in which landscape can be developed and led into our urban areas. So we have to start to think about whether these kind of things here are good landscape-led design, and this is part of a big park in central Tokyo. And to me, I like this place because it shows that interactivity with the water. It shows that it's surrounded by high-density apartment living. It's providing a cooler, more biodiverse place near in the hustle and bustle of central Tokyo, and it provides something that's quite cute in terms of the duck boats here. So others find it a bit a bit twee, not really doing anything. But I think when you start to break down the key components here, the use of water, the promotion of access to nature, that interactivity for both social and ecological species, the way in which it fits within that quite high density urban form, we can start to see that this could be really high quality or at least very high functionality in terms of urban green infrastructure. But we also need to think quite carefully about these notions of livability and how we design in that. And so are we talking about people? Are we talking about the place? Are we talking about the specific elements of a given park or given piece of green infrastructure? What functions, services and disservices are we looking at? And how have they designed in for issues about safety or climate mitigation or community engagement or even maintenance? And this particular picture from Suzhou Park in China, I think, is a really good example here where that interactivity of people and place comes together really well. You've got an older lady doing her afternoon karaoke, and her friends are sitting there, they're enjoying it, they're clapping, they're having fun. So they're using this space as a community resource, and they're sat under the big trees so that they're getting the benefits of climate cooling, and they've got a nice place to sit as well. So it's functional in terms of what these folks need. So whilst this might be a very basic design in terms of you've got some larger trees and some benches, it's actually doing quite a lot in terms of delivering socio-cultural functions. And I think sometimes we try to over elaborate designs or think beyond what is needed or what is the base level and try and be too clever in terms of our designs. But I think what this shows is that in some cases a seat and a tree can be the most effective form of landscape-led design. But if we look to a few more recent developments, and particularly a couple here in Manchester, we start to look at something like the Mayfield Depot and the Mayfield Park development, where the first public park for 100 years in central Manchester, so offering 6.5 acres really of highly diverse, multifunctional urban green space. But it's being used as the anchor really for a wider set of developments around new employment, new homes, and new retail and leisure space. So GI in this particular case is being used as the catalyst for development. Now, that's not to say that the park is not doing a lot of heavy lifting in terms of its functionality, its connectivity, and its diversity, but it does suggest that the park may not have been developed if all this other infrastructure wasn't going to be delivered as well. What it also shows is that there's this ability to offer high level design and implementation when you've got the money. And this park cost around £20 million to build. And at the moment, it is an incredibly diverse and incredibly well liked piece of infrastructure. The only critiques that really come out of it are, is it servicing all the communities around it and is it accessible to all? But what it does illustrate to me, at least, is that there are ways in which you can use quite constrained spaces in urban areas to deliver this diversity, to daylight the river and bring it back to the fore, to use connective routes to allow people to navigate the sites in different ways. And you're using the site to enable people to think about some of the history of the city, of industry, of the railway lines, of what the canal used to be used for, along with this more diverse and informal form of recreation. Now, one thing just to point out about this site is that although it's the first public park in Manchester for 100 years, it is public-private permissible access. So you're allowed on it, but you can be removed at any time, depending on what the security guards feel. So there are potentially some tensions there. But it is a really good starting point for thinking about what the future might hold for Manchester. And just to follow up on that, we have the Castlefield Viaduct, the reuse of a former railway line in central Manchester. It runs for about 2 or 3 kilometres from the centre of the city out into Salford, and it's been derelict for about 60 years. And what this has been led by the National Trust, so a British charity, and they're looking at trying to create a treetop riverside walk that actually allows people to navigate through different neighbourhoods of the city and can act as a commuter route, but also an escape from the hustle and bustle, the pollution, the noise of the city. And this sits at about a 20-meter height, so it's that sort of fifth or sixth story on a skyscraper, and it really does feel very different to other parts of the city. Because when you're up there, you're cradled by the industrial infrastructure, yet you can still see the trains and the trams going past, but you don't necessarily have that fear of that interactivity or the danger of being hit by something. What they're also aiming to do is to try and create these different gardens and different styles as you go along the Castlefield Viaduct to allow you to experience nature that's constantly changing. That changes with both the seasons, but also changes with every part of the city you engage with. And I think this has been a really positive addition to the Manchester skyline. At the moment, it is just in its testing phase. They're currently trying to get funding to extend it beyond the first sort of kilometre or 700 meters or so. And it's viewed that this could be a really positive connective route linking areas that are sometimes quite hard to navigate on foot or by bicycle. So again, this is that repurposing of industrial infrastructure that we've seen in Paris with the Promenade Plantée, in New York with the High Line, Atlanta with the Belt Line, and so on and so forth. And if we start to look further afield, we can see that there's a similar process going on in a number of other global cities, in this case in Seoul, where there is that joint look at the strategic and the local to try and ensure that the urban fabric is actually fit for purpose in the future. And Seoul, like a lot of places, has repurposed its industrial infrastructure, particularly around flyovers and railway lines, to create linear parks that both link the main Seoul station with neighborhoods, but also link different parts of the city, i.e. some of the universities with transit stops via these linear forest parks. I suppose what is the most famous example of this would be the river restoration project, which daylighted about 6 kilometers of the river in central Seoul, which has become a real hub for both tourists and locals alike. And I think what's really interesting about the way that the government of Seoul have worked to try and integrate green infrastructure into their urban fabric is to acknowledge some of the limitations that they have in terms of their space. They are surrounded by mountains, so they have to really think about what they can do internally. They're using a lot of meanwhile spaces. They're using height and variation to try and address the lack of green infrastructure at the neighborhood scale. They're also thinking about urban heat island and how you try and address that via these buffers of green space, such as the flyover near the main Seoul station, which actually has a number of trees and plants and shrubs to sort of take away some of that pollution. And they're thinking about where water goes as well, so actually using the river restoration as a really good example of sustainable urban drainage. And I think if you're looking to go to Seoul and you walk around, you'll see that there's a growing visibility of green infrastructure across the city, where it's not just these big landmark showpiece projects, but actually you're starting to see smaller neighborhoods having green pockets, be it with trees or be it with these steps going up to a different level, where they're finding ways to maximize the locations for greenery in urban areas. And again, this was led strongly by the former mayor of Seoul, who really pushed for a number of these interventions. So actually, again, it shows that strong political will and financing were incredibly popular. If we take a comparable issue here and think about Hong Kong, we have a very similar idea around land availability, around height and density, and the ways in which nature can be used to try and soften some of the extremities of urban climate, particularly around rainfall, humidity, and heat. And what I think Hong Kong has done incredibly well is to address GI from a couple of key perspectives. One is to think vertically as well as horizontally. So thinking about the role of green walls in just softening and cooling buildings, but also their surroundings. Thinking about how you might soften some of these steps up to different apartment buildings, and that was on Hong Kong Island, to provide some respite particularly from the humidity of the city. But what they also you've seen done is GI being developed into regeneration projects. So the former Hong Kong airport runway, which is picture on the top left there, has become the Sky Park, which leads into a big new transit hub, but also has thousands of new apartments being built alongside it. So you've got this very linear feature, lots of different approaches to greening and to the horticulture being used there to provide that instant access and visual amenity for green infrastructure as well. The picture just below it is the K11 shopping centre, very high-end shopping centre, and this is the dog park on the top of it near near a Michelin-starred restaurant, where you have people coming to take their dogs for a walk, to parade, to show off, to talk to friends or colleagues. And it's a really interesting idea because it's on the, I think it's either the 8th, 9th, or 10th floor of a building, and you wouldn't expect there to be a dog park on top of a shopping centre. But again, this kind of highlights the ways in which designers in Hong Kong are thinking about the maximum utility of the space that they've got, because floor space is at a premium. Costs of investing in parks is incredibly high. So how do you use the walls or the roofs of building to create new community or ecological or even economic assets? Now, if we move away from that very high density approach to use of green infrastructure and nature-based solutions, and we look at places like Leipzig and Berlin in Germany, you can see that again, we're thinking about this repurposing of urban infrastructure. We're thinking about the designing in of nature into new developments, and we're thinking about the ways in which the cities are constantly changing. And I think what's interesting here is the way in which Berlin has used both a strategic and a localized approach to urban greening, to think about its connected corridors and its network of green spaces going out to the suburbs, but also to think about places like Park am Gleisdreieck, where you're repurposing a former railhead and a rail yard into a park with lots of various pockets and dimensions to think about history, but also to think about recreation. We can also see places like Rummelsburg, which is the bottom left and the bottom right picture, where you see the integration of sustainable water features as a core design component. And what's interesting about Rummelsburg is that it's a series of new developments, each of which get progressively more and more nature-led. So you get these innovative rain gardens here on the bottom right, but then you get more purposeful, biodiverse rain gardens as you move further into development. And I think what's really key to some of the ideas around particularly water management and urban biodiversity in Germany is that it should be visible, that it needs to be tactile, that they need to make those links between people and place. So really the design is that facilitator of that interactivity. And I think that's made it really key in terms of their success, because they're not placing nature behind a fence, they're not placing it in a peripheral area on the suburbs, they're putting it in the center of communities, and therefore people can understand and interact and start to learn about the value of natural cycles and where water comes from and where it goes, start to see that different species respond to the biodiversity in this rain garden, for example, and to think about how they might want to live in different neighborhoods in the future. Of course, this really keys on to the ways in which some German cities are really thinking progressively about sustainable development and about climate proofing their cities. So thinking about access and sustainable transport, but also that immediacy of having green space within a 5-10 minute walk of your home, which we also see in Paris as well. And so if we start to put all these ideas together, we can see that really good design for green infrastructure and nature-based solutions are reactions to changing demographics, to changing climates, to changing economic perspectives and understandings of what urban areas should look like. And they create places that are dynamic and interactive and therefore have a plasticity to them. They have an ability to morph to what's needed by a particular community, and therefore they aren't static. And I think that's an incredibly important thing to recognize when we're looking at really good best practice and how it might translate between locations. Because if we're talking about putting the right place on the right piece of GI in the right place, and that could be thematically or even spatially, then we have to think about how we're reacting to climate change or flood mitigation, access to nature, gentrification. And this is just one example where, in my opinion, it's not been done that effectively. So the Sabarmati Riverfront in um, Ahmedabad in Gujarat is a place where they've channelized the main river. They've created this boulevard, this walkway along both sides of the river. It's very concrete, very hot. A lot of the trees that have been developed there haven't really taken because it's too hot, and they've moved people out and they've disturbed the floodplain as it was, and they've created problems with flooding further downstream. Now, the picture on the right is one of the two parks that they've built, and these parks are really nice. They're really well managed, but you can see that there's a big fence on the right-hand side and then the big wall on the left-hand side, and you have to pay to get into them. So they're creating a resource which is nominally for everybody, but actually it might exclude some people. So if we're going to think thematically about what GI can do in terms of being landscape-led green infrastructure, then we have to think quite carefully about, is this the right project in the right place? And so firstly, we have to think about maximizing floor space and maximizing up sort of rooftops and maximizing green walls as well. So we've already seen a few of these ideas, but the Miyashita Park in Tokyo, in Shibuya, Shibuya is a really good example of a shopping centre with a new park on top. The park used to be at ground level, but it was moved when the development changed, and it creates this oasis really in very central Tokyo that is quiet, that has amenities like toilets and park. It has recreational facilities, a volleyball court, for example, and a climbing wall, and it just presents this alternative to the hustle and bustle of the street level. So I think we can think quite carefully about, if we're doing new builds, how do we maximize our floor and roof space to be greener? And it's something that we've seen lots of in Europe before, with the sort of the Italian balcony culture of growing vegetables and plants on balconies because of the sunlight and the heat. But can we scale this up to be something like the Solio 7017, which is the big old freeway overlooking the main station in Seoul? Also, we need to think carefully about green infrastructure being a facilitator and a reaction to social needs in planning. And I think here we're starting to think about some of those metrics that we discussed earlier on. How far do we need to live from a green space? How far will we walk? What mode of transport can we take? And how large is a piece of green infrastructure? And in 2023, the national GI standard was released in England, which looked to try and create a more contemporary metric that actually allowed us to think quite carefully about what what do we actually need in our urban areas. And the two things that really came out of this was the need for doorstep or immediate forms of green infrastructure, something that was within a 5-minute walk of your home, somewhere where you could be and interact with it every day. And this is now government policy, and it's led to a rethinking about how we build in nature to our urban areas, and particularly high density urban areas. If we also think about some of the bigger issues that have happened over the last 5 or 6 years, and we start to think about health and well-being, and particularly responses to COVID, I think we also need to think carefully about the ways in which we design in green space into housing estates, into apartment complexes, and what kind of interactivity we can build in. We need to think about how the climate is moderated. We need to think about wind flow. We need to think about water, we need to think about biodiversity. And I think one thing that COVID really did for us was it allowed people to rethink their relationships with nature, and therefore those conversations around access and quality and quantity have become quite common in political discourses, at least in the UK, to try and persuade local government and national government to invest in nature as essential infrastructure, as we pointed out before. But of course, we mustn't just forget that people have very clear understandings of space, and they have ways in which they identify with certain areas compared to others. So although we could suggest that all green infrastructure, all parks, all street trees are community assets, it's not always the case when people feel that they're excluded from these places. So work that was undertaken in Belfast in Northern Ireland a few years ago try to highlight whether there were parts of the city where people felt particularly a strong identity to, and where they felt stigmatized. And they really were depending on age and depending on cultural background, be it nationality or religion. And that offers quite a lot of potential constraints to government to try and develop new infrastructure, because we're looking to create multifunctional, multi-purpose spaces that are attractive to others. But we mustn't forget that context here is very important, because it might be quite difficult to negotiate with older people who are very used to a particular urban form or particular location, and to try and make them to engage with somewhere else. Younger people maybe less so, because they might not have the same social attachments. But we need to think carefully about societal needs and what they do. And of course, this can be done by thinking locally, but also by thinking in terms of creating landmark sites, such as the Gardens by the Bay in Singapore, the Bishan Ang Mo Kio Park in Singapore, or even the Bund in Shanghai in China. Places where there's been an attention to detail around creating an investment that's the anchor point for urban development around it. And therefore it allows politicians and financial folks to think about the benefits of these interventions, but also to align with local communities to consider what actually needs to happen in terms of the delivery of core everyday functions. So access to nature, water management, climate adaptation, and so on. And so if we're thinking about large scale investments, and we might include the Sabarmati riverfront here from Ahmedabad, that you can get it right or you can get it wrong, depending on how well you designing biodiversity, designing climate change adaptation, designing that everyday livability about it. And so one thing that GI has tried to do, and we see this across the world in terms of regeneration projects, so the Landschaft Park in Duisburg North, for example, be another example, where we've seen the design being developed with landscape to therefore become a place that entices people in. That again is that facilitator, that activator of action and interactivity with that space. And so when we're thinking about green infrastructure or landscape-led design and planning, we have to think about these political and these economic drivers, the ways in which form, function, and design drive certain perspectives on what's positive and what's not. We also have to think about what the cultural perspectives are on nature, and how certain folks in Brazil might not like standing water because of a fear of disease, for example, or a fear of crime in other urban parks. And of course, the ecological and climatic drivers of those places. And I think what we end up with is a combination of all these things working collectively, but also occasionally working against each other, so creating these contestations. So how does the economic value of a development support the needs of local communities or cultural norms of that place? So we have to think quite carefully in terms of how we negotiate through these different ideas collectively. And so what we should be looking at, and this is a picture from the top of of Kyoto Station in Japan, and it's a roof garden that allows you views across the entire city, and it's calm, it's quiet, lots of places to sit, people here having their lunches, people here talking quietly on the phone because it's Japan. But what we need to consider is that we ensure that landscape-led design aims to integrate policy making with political support and financial understanding to be more interactive and multi-directional in terms of development conversations. We shouldn't just be asking the same people to do the same thing over and over again, because we'll end up making the same mistakes. But what we're starting to see, or what we've seen for many years, particularly in the landscape profession, is a whole set of people working collaboratively across the globe to try and think about context, try and think about design quality and design function, and to try and think differently about how we manage our urban environments. And so if we're thinking about the lessons that we can learn from linking green infrastructure and landscape-led urban regeneration, then we should present GI and landscape as essential infrastructure that is given the same amount of prestige, visibility, and priority as other forms of grey infrastructure or economic development ideas. that we need to understand the variation in scales and functions that natural systems work in. And I know as the landscape profession we know this, but then convey that to those different disciplines that work within and across urban areas. We also need to consider how these more technical but also more informal spaces can work collectively. And again, it comes back to that suite, that portfolio of different types of investment that can be used to address specific issues, be it heat and humidity, be it recreation, or be it access to different forms of nature. And within that, we can start to think about how the localized, the small scale can be of equal, if not more meaningful benefits to individuals than something that's at the city scale. And particularly when we're talking about larger cities, I mean, this could be Sao Paulo, it could be Rio, it could be Mexico City, it could be, in the case of these images, Kyoto or Tokyo or Hong Kong. How we try and ensure that there's this whole scale and range of resources that are immediate and within a 5-minute walk, that are of a certain size to accommodate hundreds, if not thousands, of people collectively, and how they all fit together into a wider network of green and blue spaces. And all this is obviously couched in an understanding of the history of a location, its design principles, either from a formal perspective or how people interact with it, what's happened and what's succeeded before and what's failed. And of course, we don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel each time, but we do have to think proactively about how we create better and more sustainable places, and how the use of more technical GI interventions, sustainable drainage solutions, green walls, green roofs, can be mapped effectively alongside street trees, small, medium and large city scale parks, to deliver a whole range of different benefits to the whole of society. And I think if we continue to look across the world for best practice examples and to share knowledge and experience, we can really highlight how green infrastructure can be classified as an essential infrastructure, because it does deliver on the mandates of all governments in all places. So thank you very much for listening. Here are my contact details. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me. So thank you very much.